Welcome to Living the Smarter Science of Slim, where we provide a scientifically proven lifestyle for long-term health and fat loss by eating more and exercising less, but smarter.
Eat smarter, exercise smarter, live better. I am so ready for that. Jonathan Bailor, this is Carrie Brown. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing really well, Carrie. I'm excited today to talk about protein because it's one of my favorite things to talk about since it's such an important part of living a sane lifestyle.
I love protein.
I am a fan as well, and the scientific community is quite a bit a fan of protein as well. And that's really what I want to cover today because protein is such a critical component of not only our body, but it's going to be a critical component of what we eat. And it's so fantastically healthy for us. And there's been some misinformation about it. And I want to make sure we get the facts on the table this week. So let's talk about the science of protein.
Let's get some facts.
So let's start with Dr. Halton over at Harvard University, who tells us exchange of protein for carbohydrate has been shown to improve blood lipids. Higher protein diets have been associated with lower blood pressure and reduced risk of coronary heart disease, which is great because I believe this statistic is somewhere between 3 and 4 of the deaths, or excuse me, 3 to 4 out of every 10 deaths that occur in the United States every year have to do with a heart issue. So if we can help our hearts by eating a higher protein diet, that's certainly good news.
That's awesome news. And I think I've said this probably a dozen times already, but I'm going to say it again because it's so exciting, is that when I started eating a significant amount more protein, my muffin top disappeared. So I exchanged my muffin top for protein.
Yes, that is
and that made me so happy, trade. I can't even tell you.
That's your own version of exchanging protein for carbohydrates, as Dr. Halton put it. But one of the things, and we talked about this back when we talked about the S in SANE or satiety, one of the key reasons that protein is so useful for us is it is so satisfying. So there's many reasons it's useful, but most of the time when we eat more protein, ironically, we'll be eating more food and we will be more full, but many studies have shown that this actually causes a spontaneous or unconscious reduction of calories, meaning we will accidentally eat fewer calories while taking in more nutrition because of all the other sane foods we're eating. But that partially explains the muffin top disappearance. Protein also changes the hormonal balance of our body, again contributing to that muffin top disappearance. And then finally, we also know that protein helps to preserve our lean muscle tissue, which is so important to having a slim and healthy physique rather than one that is just everything is broken down and burnt off, which is not what we're after. We're after fat loss and the preservation of lean tissue, which protein does. And finally, Carrie, we know that protein is very inefficient. So when we eat more protein, our body will actually metabolize fewer calories or burn more calories just during digestion. So it's really a multifaceted attack on that muffin top, which is just great.
The thing I really, really noticed, apart from the fact that my muffin top miraculously disappeared, was that my cravings dropped. My cravings, I should clarify, for sugar and starch dropped dramatically, almost unbelievably. I was like, what happened to me? This is really weird because I don't even want to eat that stuff anymore, which for anyone that knows me, hey, I'm a pastry chef. That's just been part of my life, and to not have those cravings was a miracle. It certainly helped me enormously to not have the cravings. Then you don't feel like you're depriving yourself because
Absolutely.
Without the craving, you don't feel you're missing anything. So that helped me enormously. And that was the protein that did that.
Absolutely. Well, remember, when we talk about the 3 common components to sane foods, it's protein, water, and fiber. So protein really is front and center. And in some ways, you could almost think of, just building off what you said, Carrie, protein is almost like a prescription to eliminate cravings. Like you're never going to get rid of cravings by starving yourself. In fact, that will cause cravings to go up. However, if you quote unquote take protein or eat whole food protein, man, it will really keep those cravings at bay because of what it does from a satisfaction perspective as well as what it does from a hormonal perspective. So very, very powerful stuff.
I love protein, and protein apart from that is some of the the tastiest food there is.
Very, very tasty. Well, and again, folks, one of the other benefits we talked about was the preservation of lean muscle tissue. And just to really bring that point home, because that's really important, right? We want to burn fat. We don't want to burn off everything. We just want to burn off fat. Dr. Donald Lehman over at the University of Illinois tells us point blank, quote, use of higher protein diets reduces lean tissue loss to less than 15%, and when combined with exercise, can halt loss of lean tissue during weight loss. Now, Carrie, that is actually a very profound finding, because remember we talked about earlier that when people go on starvation diets, up to 70% of the non-water weight lost can be from lean tissue, and that's terrible for us in the long term, and that we really want to avoid that. Well, what Dr. Lehman is telling us here, that just by eating more protein, we can reduce that number to 15%, and then when we combine smarter exercise, which involves eccentric resistance training, we can basically eliminate the loss of lean tissue, which is wonderful. And that's what gives us that tight, full, firm figure and keeps us strong and feeling healthy and robust rather than being broken down. And that's it's just so powerful. And another thing to keep in mind when we talk about the recommendations around how much protein to consume is that everything about a sane lifestyle should be thought of in the context of smarter exercise. This isn't just a way of eating, it's an entire new approach to eating and to exercise. So when we say, well, let's just say it, the recommendation for protein on a sane type of lifestyle is anywhere from between 125 grams if you're a smaller woman to 200 grams if you're a larger man. The reason that range is so critical is for what we just talked about, and we have to remember we're resistance training in a very intense fashion, so we're breaking down our body protein, we're breaking down our muscle tissue, and we need to have the ability to rebuild that. So if you were to look at this way of eating just in isolation, it looks different than when you look at it from and your resistance training. Okay, I see why you definitely need that protein now. So we have to remember that this is an integrated, complete lifestyle, not just a quote unquote diet.
Could I just mention that everything hurts today, and I blame you.
Hurts in a good way?
Everything. My entire body hurts today. Well, you brought up exercise, so my entire body hurts, and it's all your fault.
Well, that is actually good news, because that means your body is spending its calories rebuilding and building new and repairing muscle tissue rather than potentially building new fat tissue, it's always better to build and maintain lean tissue than it is to build or maintain fat tissue. So,
Jonathan?
Yes?
Your chair is squeaking and it's driving me mad.
I know. I'm going to try to stop squeaking chair. I will sit forward in it. But, Carrie, let's now move on to the haters. We've talked about why protein is so useful, and we'll continue to talk about why protein is so useful, but some of the common objections that our listeners may hear when people see them eating, and really, folks, I'm not talking about like go eat a crazy amount of protein. It's just really breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Make sure you're taking in at least 30 grams of protein, and then if you happen to have some snacks, take in some protein there as well. And just as long as at every meal you're taking in a substantive amount of protein, you'll hit that 125 mark, and you'll be too full for starches and sweets. So that said, people are still, they're always trying to look for something to poke at when you're not doing what everyone else is doing. So the first thing you may hear is talking about protein's impact on liver function. So this is simply just not borne out. Another one has to do with kidney function. Let's talk about both of those, liver and kidney function. So, for example, Dr. Manine over at the University of
somewhere.
It's the University of somewhere, Oulu, I think it might be in Hawaii. Not sure. Anyway.
Sorry, Hawaii.
Sorry, Hawaii. Simply stated, there is no scientific evidence whatsoever that high protein intakes have adverse effects on liver function. And then Dr. Halton over at Harvard University talks to the kidney objection with, there is little evidence that high protein diets pose a serious risk to kidney function in healthy populations. Now, combine those two, so no scientific evidence substantiating these objections. And on the other hand, guess how many studies have shown dozens of health benefits and body fat benefits stemming from a more natural intake of protein. And I say natural intentionally carry, because when we look back at our evolutionary ancestry, getting this level of protein was quite common. And in fact, Dr. Cordain, who's one of the pioneers of the Paleolithic type lifestyle and has done amazing research over at Colorado State University, tells us, quote, "There is now a large body of experimental evidence increasingly demonstrating that a higher intake of lean animal protein reduces the risk for cardiovascular disease, hypertension, dyslipidemia, obesity, insulin resistance, and osteoporosis while not impairing kidney function." Which is that's a pretty strong endorsement.
That is a pretty strong endorsement. But I just want to say there are going to be, and I'm glad you used the word normal back a few paragraphs ago, there are going to be some people for whom their kidneys don't necessarily function right, for whom if you eat a lot of protein, that might be a problem. But, if you're one of those people, you probably know that.
Exactly.
What we're talking about is, the 98% of the problem whose kidneys work fine. This is not going to be a problem. There's always exceptions to the rule. But those people, obviously need to get that figured out with a medical professional in their own way.
Absolutely. And it's important. I mean, hopefully no responsible medical professional would tell you that because you have poor kidney function that you should now eat sugar and starch. So
right.
They won't say that. So, but the other thing to keep in mind is I feel a little bit odd when we say things even like a high amount of protein, because like as Dr. Cordain goes on to tell us, and this is a direct quote and I love it, so-called very high protein diets, aka diets where you get around 30% of your energy from protein, quoting Dr. Cordain again, actually represent the norm which conditioned the present-day human genome. The evolutionary template would predict that human health and well-being will suffer when dietary intakes fall outside this range. And the basic point Dr. Cordain is making here is how could a ratio of protein that was the norm for 99.8% of our evolutionary existence now somehow spontaneously be bad for us?
Well, it's relative, isn't it? It's relative to what we have become accustomed to eating. So it seems high relative to what we've done for the last 40 years.
And we know how well what we've done for the past 40 years has worked out. So fortunately, the bar is, I guess, very low in terms of, certainly it's not like, oh man, what we've been doing has worked so well. So we should definitely stick with that. But just to drive this home, Boyd Eaton and Dr. Connor over at Emory University further echo this point. I'm going to quote them now. "It would be paradoxical if humans should now somehow be harmed as a result of protein intake habitually tolerated or even required by their near relatives." And one key point here is these researchers, at least Dr. Cordain, back a few minutes ago, mentioned animal protein. And a common question we get asked about the Smarter Science of Slim is it compatible with a vegetarian lifestyle? And it absolutely is. You don't have to get your protein from animal sources. Animal sources of protein are fantastically healthy for you when they're from high quality animal sources, but it is absolutely not required. One of my favorite success stories about the Smarter Science of Slim is a middle-aged woman who was diabetic, and after I think 12 weeks of a sane lifestyle, and she's a vegetarian, mind you, lost around 48 pounds and was able to go off her diabetes medication. So, and again, she was just using vegetarian sources of protein and had great success. So animal proteins are wonderful for us, but if for moral reasons or cultural reasons you avoid them, there's no reason you still can't be sane.
That's awesome. I personally couldn't give up bacon, but...
Yeah, it's a general. I was actually discussing this with someone and they really liked it, so I'll share it here. Eating sanely is really, we've talked about this, there are just 4 factors that we use to evaluate the quality of food: satiety, aggression, nutrition, and efficiency. So you could be on a low carb diet and do that sanely. You could be sane low carb. You could be sane paleo. You could be sane vegetarian. You could be sane Atkins. You could be sane South Beach. You could be sane zone. Sane is just a way we evaluate food. So really you can be, call it whatever you want it, just keep it satisfying, unaggressive, nutritious, and inefficient, you're good to go.
Except you don't need to be all those other things. If you're sane, you'll get where you want to go.
That's true as well. So, but if they're helpful for you, you're feel free to continue along that path. So let's talk about some now. Let's shift back to praising protein. We'll alternate between the haters on protein and then just lathering protein up with praise. I'm not sure if lathering is the correct word, but just protein, yay. So Dr. Willett, who's the chair of the over at the Department of Nutrition at the Harvard School of Public Health, tells us that the Nurses' Health Study is the only large prospective study to have examined the link between dietary protein and cardiovascular disease. The group of women who ate the most protein were 25% less likely to have had a heart attack or to have died of heart disease. Eating a lot of protein does not harm the heart. And then Dr. McCullough from the American Cancer Society tells us seafood and poultry have been associated with lower rates of coronary heart disease and cancer. So with all of this evidence stacking in favor of protein and just common sense that these natural foods containing protein, why would we have evolved to eat them if they were harmful? That just doesn't make sense. You could certainly be wondering, like, how did these myths that protein is bad for us get started in the first place? And the reason is, Carrie, there were some animal studies done where researchers fed animals extreme amounts of protein, and then these animals experienced problems. But my interpretation of these studies is rather than proving that the levels of protein we're talking about are harmful, these studies actually prove that until we exceed 2 grams of protein per pound of body weight per day, we will only get healthier and slimmer by upping our protein intake. I mean, to put that in perspective, Carrie, 2 grams of protein per pound of body weight in like a 150-pound woman would be that woman eating 11 chicken breasts per day, every day. That's
Wow.
physically impossible. Like we're not gonna accidentally eat too much protein.
There wouldn't be a lot of non-starchy veggies going down with 11 chicken breasts, would there?
Well, and besides that, Carrie, I mean that would give her about 300 grams of protein, and that would mean that about 60% of her total daily caloric intake would be coming from protein. And that's an imbalanced diet. Like no one over here is saying eat 60% of your calories from protein. That's much too high. What we're saying is just, again, let's move more towards our evolutionary heritage and let's eat between 125 and 200 grams of protein, because bad things happen if we eat too much of anything. Almost every year we hear about some stunt on the radio where some shock jock is like trying to see how much water they can drink, and they end up having to be rushed to the hospital, and even some cases dying from overhydration. So
Yep.
even drinking too much water can be bad for us. So, but again, good thing we're not advocating that, because it's not what we're
Again,
about.
I think that the problem here is relativity, is that because when you eat a sane diet, you almost certainly eat more protein than we've gotten used to eating over the last 30 to 40 years,
Yep.
that it seems high. It isn't, it just seems that way.
Absolutely. And the other thing, let's just kind of talk about this directly. Probably the most well-known criticizer of protein would be a book called The China Study, which basically makes the assertion that animal products, specifically protein, causes cancer. First, if you haven't already, go to Google and type in China Study debunked, because the China Study book bears little resemblance to the actual China study that was conducted. And a brilliant woman by the name of Denise Minger has done a beautiful critical analysis of the book, and I would encourage you to check it out. The other thing to keep in mind is that while the China study itself, which is very distinct from the book of the same name, that's one epidemiological study. Now, both of the words one and epidemiological matter a lot here, because making a lifestyle change based on one study can quickly make your life very complicated, because every single week you'll see, study A conflicts with study B, conflicts with study C, and we should never change anything in our life based on one scientific study. further, Carrie, an epidemiological study is a study where researchers look at people and they find correlations. And that's all they find. So, for example, they might say there was more death among people. I'm just going to make up an example here. People who watched comedies had a higher rate of death than people who watched dramas on television. And in fact, you could look at any population sample and you could find correlations like that.
Right.
But that certainly doesn't prove that watching comedies kills you.
Right.
Right. At all. In fact, what these epidemiological studies do is they can generally show us interesting things to test clinically. Like if we did see that in a massive study over 20 years that looked at 100,000 people, found that people who laughed more died more frequently, well, then we might want to get someone in a controlled environment and hold everything else constant and then make them laugh and see what about laughter could be causing death. But we certainly, without doing that, we can't go out and say things like, well, clearly we all need to stop laughing because laughing causes death. And actually this analogy works pretty well because what the China study book tells us basically is that individuals who ate animal products had a higher incidence of death. And when we unpack that, that's actually not true. Individuals who ate more seafood, for example, had a lower incidence of death. And even if that was true, we don't know, like, were they smoking? Were they doing this? Were they doing that? And Carrie, what's even more important is that was one epidemiological study. We've got so many other epidemiological studies like the Nurses' Health Study we just heard from Dr. Willett. That's a huge epidemiological study which found that the women who ate the most protein were 25% less likely to have a heart attack or die of heart disease. And we have even, let's look at the Journal of the American Medical Association that did a meta-analysis of 147 studies on the impact of diet and health, and found zero correlation between meat consumption and cardiovascular disease. So that's 147 studies. 147 is greater than 1. So, and then separately...
I knew you were good at math.
Separately, researchers found that people in England, Carrie, your hometown,
Woo-hoo!
have eaten about the same amount of animal fat, which is what most people, if they're concerned with the consumption of meat, they're concerned with it because of animal fat. So people in England have eaten about the same amount of animal fat since 1910. Meanwhile, the number of heart attacks have increased 1,000% between 1930 and 1970. Well, if the animal fat percentage stayed constant during that time period, how could it play a role in that 1,000% heart attack increase?
We love our animal fat in England.
And-
we do. We eat lard, we eat bacon, we eat all
Yep.
sorts of fun animal fat
And
things.
if it stayed constant while heart attacks rose, it would be pretty odd for it to be the cause. And again, Carrie, during the same basic period in the U.S., we saw a similar increase in heart attacks while the amount of animal fats being consumed actually dropped. So the data, like the clinical data and the mass of data in the scientific community shows us that meat is not unhealthy. It's a fantastic source of protein and therefore a key part of a natural diet. And in fact, Dr. O'Keefe at the Mid-America Heart Institute listed all the advantages and tells us that, quoting, diets high in lean animal protein can improve lipid profiles and overall health. Lean animal protein eaten at regular intervals improves satiety levels, increases thermogenesis, aka calorie burning, improves insulin sensitivity, aka clears our hormonal clog, and thereby facilitates weight loss while providing many essential nutrients.
That was an awful lot of geekiness, and I think I need to reel you in.
But I mean,
If you say epidemiological or whatever that word is one more time, I think I'm going to poke you.
I don't think I'm going to. I think I'm past that. But I do want to bring up one more bit of data because I feel like we've provided our listeners with a bunch of great ammunition. We put a bunch of great science on the table, but at some point they may read some misguided magazine article arguing that protein promotes osteoporosis. Now, this myth It is a myth. It comes from the fact that digesting protein does require more calcium than the digestion of fat or carbohydrate. Now, certain individuals falsely infer that this means that eating more protein will suck calcium from our bones and turn us into jellyfish.
And I got to tell you, for anyone that's ever met Jonathan Bailor, you would never describe him as a jellyfish.
Not a jellyfish.
There's nothing jelly going on over there.
Nothing jelly. Well, no, and in fact, folks, I mean, it's actually an important, very important. You know, if you want to strengthen your bones, consuming the sane amount of protein as well as doing the resistance training we recommend, it's going to do nothing but make them even more dense. And this is from Dr. Western Plantanga over at the Kerry British Maastricht University. Quoting, with respect to adverse effects, no protein-induced effects are observed on net bone balance or on calcium balance in young adults and elderly persons. Dietary protein even increase bone mineral mass and reduces the incidence of osteoporotic fracture. Protein is all good.
Protein's awesome.
Haters are going to hate, but that's just because they haven't been informed. But, you know, hopefully we can inform them someday.
We love protein. Well, you know, our job is to tell people the truth, and then they will go do what they decide to do.
Exactly. And in fact, the one thing that is potentially, I'll say the one drawback of protein, and it's not a protein's fault per se, but the way protein has been messaged to us is the misinformation around good sources of protein. So call me crazy, but I like to define a good source of protein as a common food that has more of its calories coming from protein than coming from fat or coming from carbohydrate.
I think that's where a lot of us have gone wrong over the years, because I bet you most people would say that milk is a great source of protein.
I think that's
not.
fair. Well, and it's fair because, well, we've never, what does it mean to be a good source of protein?
Right.
Does it mean that there is protein in it? I don't think that makes it a good source. I would say it's a good source if there's more protein in it than there is carbohydrate or fat, because I mean, what else is a good source of protein, right?
Right, but people have never looked at it that way. Well, I certainly never have.
Let's get them looking.
And now, you know, even after all this time, I still have to consciously make the shift to not think of milk as a protein.
Absolutely.
I mean, I'm still mentally going, no, milk's not a good source of protein.
Yep. No, exactly. So, I mean, when we talk about milk, which I believe is actually more like in the range, depending on the fat content of the milk, in the range of 20 to 30% protein by weight. You know, it's not a good source of protein when, for example, we could be eating things like seafood, which, depending on the type of seafood, ranges from 51 to 94% protein. Things like egg whites are 91% protein. Skinless white meat is 51 to 80% protein. Protein powders, like whey, are greater than 70% protein. Things like fat-free or low-fat cottage cheese and Greek yogurt are anywhere from 60% protein to 85% protein. And this is, Carrie put this point so well in an earlier podcast. When we say things like egg whites or skinless white meat chicken, we're not saying those things because fat is bad. We're just saying if you're trying to eat protein, an egg white is 91% protein by weight, whereas a whole egg is somewhere, I think it's like 30 or 40% protein. So it doesn't mean a whole egg is bad. It just means a whole egg is a great source of healthy fats. An egg white is a great source of healthy protein.
Right.
So
it's not about low fat. It's about high protein.
Or just in this context.
Good source of protein.
Yeah, it's just if you're eating a bunch of ham, which is far and away mostly protein, then you could probably eat the whole egg because you're going to get some protein from the egg, and the ham is actually a good source of protein. But if you're just eating eggs, you might want to blend some egg whites with some whole eggs to balance out the ratio of protein to fat. So, and there's other pretty good sources of protein. And I say pretty good, Carrie, because, I mean, these are some of the things we just talked about. They still get quite a few of their calories from fat, which is fine. But if we're getting let's say if we're eating like an egg, like we just said, and an egg is only 35% protein by weight, let's call it a pretty good source of protein because there's certainly better sources of protein.
Right.
And there's three pretty good sources of protein. Things like skinless dark meat and a lot of red meat is going to be between 33 and 66% protein. Soybeans, which are good for vegetarians, they're not my personal preference. They're really only 33% protein, and whole eggs, again, 35% protein. Everything else is not even close to being a good source of protein. Carrie, I think in an earlier episode, we went through and we talked about how, like a serving like 250 calories of nuts contains less protein than an equal amount of like lettuce. And again, it doesn't mean nuts are bad. It just means there's actually very few good sources of protein. And that's another reason why it's going to be really hard for us to ever overeat it, because we generally have to go out of our way to consume a sane amount of protein, whereas consuming a sane amount of fat or a sane amount of carbohydrates is quite easy.
It's interesting that for me, and also I've seen on the community and other places, getting enough protein is one of the biggest problems that people have with eating sanely is eating enough protein, not the opposite. We've just talked about how, the haters are saying you're going to eat too much protein and make yourself ill. It's actually really hard to eat as much protein as you suggest. It
is very, very hard. And folks, it is just so key, because that protein, along with those non-starchy vegetables, I mean, literally, Carrie's said this and you will experience it firsthand. If you can hit that 10 plus servings of non-starchy vegetables and the 125 to 200 grams of protein,
it's going to be stuffed.
You will never have to worry about eating insane foods, because you will be physically repulsed by them. You'll be like, get that away from me. You'll just always be too full. And man, that's a good state to be in, because it's like you really don't even have to try.
It's incredible. It's wonderful, but it's incredible to me how my palate has changed over the last 6 months. Now, things that I used to eat, now I just almost are too sweet. I can't even put them in my mouth. And I know a lot of that is to do with the fact that I've eaten so much sane food that now my tastes have changed, which makes it easier.
Makes it absolutely easier. So folks, it's all about ensuring we get a general rule of thumb, and there's actually some really cool emerging research about this, which is make sure when you get your protein, you get it in adequate doses, meaning you want to make sure that when you eat protein, you eat 30 grams or more at a time. This actually triggers a different reaction in your body. It helps to stimulate what's called muscle protein synthesis, or the rebuilding of tissue, which is great, right? Our body is constantly regenerating cells, because the cells they die and they come and we generate new cells. So think about eating, 30 to 50 or 60 grams of protein in a sitting, 3 to 4 times a day, however works for you, and just really enjoy that. And of course, if you get fat along with it, that's fine. We know fat's not bad for us, and then add some non-starchy vegetables on the side, and you'll be sane, and you'll be healthy, and you'll be happy, and you'll be too full for anything else.
And you'll have no muffin top.
And you will have no muffin
That's
top.
very important for us girls, Jonathan.
No, it is important for all of us. There's men. We have a different muffin top. It usually just comes out of the front, but it the muffin top just kind of tips over more. So and folks, just to one of the single most common critique or criticism that I hear about a sane way of eating is people still think that it is a way of eating that is afraid of fat. And I assure you that is not true, right? When we talk about lean things, we've said this ad nauseum, I'm going to say it again, it's simply because in that context, we're trying to get more protein. It's not because fat is bad. And just to drive that home, I want to give you even more support for the message that fat is not bad. And I'm going to I'm going to go one school, but I'm going to go pretty prestigious school. Let's look at just the Harvard Medical School's take on artificially eliminating foods containing fat from our diet, not only to show our support for dietary fat, but also because a lot of things that contain protein also contain fat. So if we're going to eat enough protein, we also have to be comfortable eating fat. So, Carrie, let's alternate quotes because there's quite a few of them. So why don't you start with the first ones? These are all coming from the Harvard Medical School.
The emphasis on total fat reduction has been a serious distraction in efforts to control obesity and improve health in general.
Boom. Quote number 2. Within the United States, a substantial decline in the percentage of energy from fat during the last 2 decades has corresponded with a massive increase in the prevalence of obesity. Diets high in fat do not appear to be the primary cause of the high prevalence of excess body fat in our society, and reductions in fat will not be a solution.
Among European countries, no association was observed between the national percentage of energy from fat and median body mass index in men. A clear inverse relation was observed in women.
Limiting unsaturated fats, which is usually done by increasing carbohydrate, is detrimental. This is consistent with metabolic studies indicating that replacing unsaturated fats with carbohydrate increases triglycerol and decreases HDL cholesterol. Furthermore, low-fat, high-carbohydrate diets provide a higher glycemic load, aggravate hyperinsulinemia, aka clogging, and may thus cause increased risk for diabetes and coronary artery disease.
And last one, studies and trials have provided strong evidence that a higher intake of omega-3 fatty acids from fish or plant sources lowers the risk of coronary heart disease.
Love it. Love it. Folks, eat more sane foods, eat more smarter, exercise less, but smarter. Enjoy yourself. And next week, Carrie and I will be back with some steps we can take to start on that path towards eating more smarter. But hopefully you've got what you need to get started, and we'll see you next week.
See ya.
Wait, don't stop listening yet. If you like the podcast and if there's other ways we can help you, please join us in the Smarter Science of Slim support group, which is freely available at the Smarter Science of Slim website, smarterscienceofslim.com. There you'll find all kinds of free recipes and success stories and just all kinds of fun stuff like how to help your kids go sane and just great community content.
And just one last thing before you go, if you wouldn't mind heading over to iTunes and up onto Amazon.com and leaving us a review, and then going over to Facebook and liking us, we would hugely appreciate it.